In the previous lecture, we implemented an interface, and we learned how this interface is going to have a definition, and then we're going to implement its functionality on those classes that implement the interface. And we mentioned that before wrapping up this section, there is another important thing that we need to cover, and that is asynchronous programming. Asynchronous programming is going to be very important throughout the course, so we need to take a look at it before moving forward. Basically, what the synchronous programming is going to allow us to perform is operations that we don't really know how much are going to take. And we're going to see this very often when connecting to the internet and making requests to the internet. Basically, asynchronous programming will also allow us to enhance the overall responsiveness of our application by waiting for a task to be performed. So for example, if we have some connection to the internet being performed, we don't want the entire application to just freeze, we may be able to do something else while we wait for that connection. And during this lecture, we're going to take a look at exactly how to do that. To test this out, I am going to navigate to the bank account, and we're going to add a couple of methods that will simulate a connection to the internet. Right now, we're not really going to be connecting to the internet, but we are going to add some functionality to simulate a connection that takes about 2 seconds to be performed. So inside of the bank account class, the first thing that I want to define is that method that is going to be asynchronous. We can start by defining a normal method, which is going to be public, is going to be void, and it's going to be called getData. Up until now, this method is just a normal method. But what happens if suddenly we want this method to make a connection to the internet that may take an unknown amount of time to be performed? Well, in that case, this getData method has to be an async method. And by using the async keyword, we create an asynchronous method, just like this. On other languages, this is a little bit more difficult, but C# has made it very easy since Visual Studio 2012 to create asynchronous programming. And then what we have to do is define the method as task. Defining the method as task is necessary because it is this method the one that is going to execute that asynchronous operation, which in this case is connecting to the internet. To be able to use the task type, we can solve the issue by typing Ctrl- on Windows or Alt-Enter on Visual Studio for Mac and selecting the first option, which is adding a using directive to the system.threading.tasks namespace. And now we're able to use the task type. To simulate that connection to the internet, we can use a method that exists inside of the thread class. To be able to use this class, we also need another using directive to the system.threading namespace. The thread class has a sleep method that will pause the execution of the application for an amount of milliseconds. In this case, I'm going to set 2000 milliseconds to simulate a connection to the internet that takes 2 seconds. And so our asynchronous method is ready. This method then is going to be executing a task that is going to take an unknown amount of time. I mean, right now we do know that it's going to take 2 seconds, but in real scenarios, for example, a connection to the internet, we don't really know how long this will take. And so let's learn how to use an asynchronous method. I'm going to navigate to the program class and I'm going to create a new method. This new method also has to be static. We're going to set it to void and we're going to set it to be called getData as well. And we have the implementation of the method and it's in here where we want to get the data for a certain bank account. So the first thing that we need is that bank account. So we're going to create a new bank account that is going to have some random value as the balance and it's going to have a random owner. And with this new object, we now have access to the getData method. And we can call it just like any other method. But I want to illustrate something in here. Right now, the calling of this method doesn't really wait for it to be complete. And so, for example, I am going to add a guideline method calling here to illustrate, for example, a login execution. So the user logs in, and once the user is logged in, maybe the data for their bank account is needed. And once the data for the bank account has been obtained, we can display the data. But of course, we won't be able to display data if we haven't received that data. And currently, the getData method is not really waiting for the data. It's just being executed, but it's not waiting for the execution to be completed. Because the execution is going to take, in this case, 2 seconds. And right now what is happening is that the user logs in, or well, this line is being printed, then the getData method is called, and immediately after, this displayData line is executed without really waiting for that data. What we have to do to wait for that data is to add the await keyword. And just like this, we are now able to use asynchronous programming. All we need is an asynchronous method defined with the async keyword and wait for it using the await keyword. Now, because we are using an asynchronous method in here, we also need to define the getData method as asynchronous. So all I have to do again is add the async keyword at the definition of the method, and now we are good to go. And then to test this, I want to comment all of the code that is inside of the main method, except the last line that prevents the console from closing at the end. And right before calling the readLine method, I want to call the getData method. And what we are expecting is for first the login line to be printed, then we should wait for 2 seconds, and only after those 2 seconds should the displayData be printed. So let's test this out on the console, and here it is running, is login, and only after a couple of seconds is the displayData line printed. What is happening is that first the login is displayed, then the getData is called, but since we are awaiting for the task to end, we have to wait for this to be completed. And only after that, only after the getData method has been completed, is the next line executed. Another thing that is going to be very important when it comes to asynchronous programming is the values that we can return. Because currently, we are not returning a task. This is just defined as a task because it takes some time to end. But once it ends, it doesn't really return a task. How do we do it to return a value like a normal method? Well, we can define this as a task that returns something that could be, for example, a string. And this is how you define the type that a task is going to return in these angle brackets. And so once the execution is completed, we can now return completed. Now there is also something that we have to take a look when it comes to obtaining this string. Let's return to the program and to the getData method. And what I want to do is create a new variable that is called task and that is equal to bankaccount.getData. And what we're going to do is write that task on the console to see what is inside of that task. So I'm going to go ahead and test this. And once the value is printed, notice that what is happening is that a task is printed. It's printed as a task. And in this case, we don't really have what the task returned. To be able to get what the task is returning, we need to await the operation. And once we await it, then the task, or in this case the variable, is going to be receiving whatever the task is going to return, in this case a string. So if we execute this one more time on the console, once the task is complete, we can see that now we get the value from the task and not the task itself. So we have already learned the basic things about C# that we needed in order for us to continue with the course. Right now, we've already implemented async programming. We are simulating a connection that takes some time, and we learn how we define asynchronous methods, how we call asynchronous methods, and how we can get those methods to return a value, and how we are going to receive that returned value. In the next section, we're going to return to our Xamarin Forms application and start implementing some more functionality once that we are a little bit more familiarized with C#. In this case, we're going to start implementing local database functionality.